Vampire. The word brings forth many different thoughts, feelings, fear, dread, disgust. But how about sadness? Is it possible to be sorrowful toward such creatures? I'd like to think so. For the most part, our actions aren't our own. We're governed by lust, anger, and an unquenchable thirst. Our making is often completely against our will, for if it wasn't, we'd have turned to dust long ago. I'm not making excuses for our countless misdeeds. How could I? It's my flesh that takes hold of their necks. It's my fangs that bore deep into their river of drink. And it's my evil heart that beats with satisfied content once my hunger has been appeased. Could the world ever understand the constant, ongoing battle that ranges in our hearts and heads? Every now and then we walk a road so twisted, so blind to the truth, the world and its straight and narrow ways, that we eventually become lost in ourselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, we leave that black and dreadful maze and remember what life was like before the curse sank its dark teeth in us and dragged us to the bottom. It wasn't always like this. I wasn't always a bad person. It's not like I woke up one day and realized, Kersey, you are a horrible, horrible human being. If I'd have thought that, things would have been much simpler. I was no longer a human being, but I was horrible, horrible. History has a way of making you forget your past scars. Layer after layer of terrible memories wrought with pain and loss can severely alter your perception. Things weren't supposed to turn out this way for me. But who would have ever thought I'd still be around 1,000 years later? As I said before, I wasn't always a bad person, quite the opposite in fact. I was a renowned soul summoner. The title was something to behold in my day, but centuries later, it's just a couple of words that crazy priests and soothsayers toss around in their convoluted sermons. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My story doesn't start there, at the height of the world, at the onslaught of the First Great War, and at the pinnacle of my holy unity with my goddess. As I sit here tonight, alone in the quiet comfort of my apple grove, I am a vampire, a caller of the dead, and 1,000-year-old woman. As you may guess, there's much I can tell. This is my last will and testament. It is intended to be read by no one. It is simply a way for my heart to be cleansed so that I might leave a heavy dosage of guilt on pages that do not judge me. The words contained in my story may sound fictional to most. There are those that do not even believe in my existence, but I say to them, I am quite real, but be glad you never got the chance to meet me. A girl named Kersey. I suppose being a troublemaker was my destiny before I even came to this world. My brother Liam was 4 years old when I was born. According to my father, he was devastated when he learned another child meant sharing toys. He would sit across from my mother eating cereal, watching the birds in the trees through the picture window, stealing glances at her ever-expanding belly. He knew what was in there and hated it. My mother's womb was a ticking time bomb, and once it exploded, Liam was no longer special. So already I began making ripples. Even before I was aware of what life was about, what it would give me and what it would take away, I was loathed. Luckily, my enemies were few and far between in the beginning. Even Liam, the spoiled little brat, eventually grew to love his new sister. I don't remember much about my early childhood, the years leading up to school, best friends, and sitting around listening to Mom and Dad read stories. These were the years I clung to Liam. His warmth and smell remain. It was the scent of youth, of vigor, of simple happiness. He was my guardian. Luckily, we lived in a sanctuary. Keswing was its name. There's not a soul on Mysteria who doesn't know that city and its grandeur. Even those who had never stepped foot on its pristine soil could trace a mental picture of it in their mind. It was beautiful when I was a little girl, and it still is today. Gleaming white walls encircled most of the countryside, hugging quaint shops and manor houses. Keswing is not just a city you see, but a kingdom. Many of the smaller districts are cut off by mountain ranges and dense forests. You can venture into the wilds, the open plains, and even the sprawling metropolis of the capital without ever leaving Keswick. We had a paradise, and I have a longing for those simple, quiet days. My family lived in a small suburb called Penny Hill, on a street called Chapel Bend. It was a tiny, hidden gem. We would see the Capitol a mile away. The steeple of the Lulusian Academy, my soon-to-be school, clearly marked the center of Keswick. We woke to the distant chime of church bells each morning. I've often tried to think of my earliest happy memory. Strangely, it's easier now to remember than when I was a mortal. Such thoughts stand out as warm and fuzzy, against a backdrop of cold and prickly. It was the 12th annual Black Dragon Hunt. Keswick was once littered with black dragons, the forests and mountains anyway. Long before I was part of the world, they were rampant. Their juvenile and adult brethren scorched the countryside with fire, and their giant strides and swinging pendulum-like tails ripped the very trees from the ground. To combat this, all dragons were hunted and killed while they were still whelps, just before their size became a problem. It was a chilly morning, and we, my father, brother, and I, had gathered around Keswick's North Plaza, the main nexus for all things in the kingdom. Everyone came together those mornings, common citizens to royalty. All people loved seeing the spoils of the dragon hunt. I stuffed my hands into the pockets of my wool jacket. My teeth chattered behind my chapped lips. I couldn't have been more than 6. Liam was already old enough to participate in the youth skinning ceremony, a privilege reserved for boys aged 9 to 14. The streets suddenly sprang to life, the crowds cheering as the massive northern gates wound open. Flickering torches lined the streets beyond, their golden glow hazy in the early morning fog. Most of this was obscured by men dragging their enormous trophies into the city. People standing on balconies and in windows showered the hunters with flowers, ferns, and whatever other beautiful trinkets they could throw down to the streets. The hunters waved, smiled, and pressed on toward the central plaza, thick, scaly bodies in tow. The dragons were wrapped in furry tarps and were pulled along by the tails. The barbed ends made excellent grips. I asked my father why the hunters covered them so. "Because the scales are tough and will mangle our pretty streets," he said. Dad picked a good spot for us every year, but this time we'd been pressed far back beneath the overhanging balcony of a cooper. When the hunter's trek ended, there was a throng of people blocking our view. I so badly wanted to see the dragons. Liam paced back and forth, anxious as well. Instead of waiting, he shoved his way through the crowds and found a spot up front. I, on the other hand, was much too little to be left alone, no matter how honorable we considered our city. With a grunt, my father picked me up and perched me on his shoulders. My tiny feet dangled impishly down his chest. I held onto his head as if any small shifting of his step would topple me. But from this vantage point, I could see everything, even Liam hopping up and down at the sight of such majestic creatures. Perhaps he was only excited to start the skinning. The scaly bodies were incredible. They looked like the hide of a fish, large, overlapping, round scales. Most were dark and dingy, but some places, mainly along the head, were shiny. Some of them had been beheaded, but these were quite young, long before their scales had time to harden. A lethal jab to the heart right behind the front legs was the method preferred. They looked so at peace in death, yet the sight of them was lacking something I couldn't comprehend. I longed to see them alive, active, walking, and breathing. I wanted to see their wings extended, even though I knew they couldn't fly at such a young age. On the cobblestones, they were folded up like a fan collecting dark crimson blood. A few hours later, after food, drink, and merriment, the skinning ceremonies began. It was all done out of respect for Keswick's natural beauty. Curb the dragon populace and save the trees, rivers, and elk. It was also a way to obtain a much-needed, not to mention extremely rare, resource. The dragons were hauled to Chalice Park, the largest and most popular span of green in the city. Each of the beasts were turned on their backs, wings outstretched along the ground. Liam was wearing a Lelusian robe, tall boots, and thick leather gloves. He smiled back at us and waved his knife above his head. I was sitting squarely between my mother and father and giddily waved back. I was so proud of him. Even at that age, I remember being proud of my brother. A skilled dragon hunter named Theron Nellander walked around the group of youngsters and gave instructions on removing the armored plate of scales. Each year, my mother lost the fight to stay and watch. It was indeed a disgusting thing to see. Dad always asked me if I also wanted to leave, and normally I'd take his offer. It didn't feel right without Mom there. But for some reason, I stayed that year. Maybe it was because of Liam's participation, or maybe my new fondness for the macabre. The children inserted the blades at the throat and ripped straight down to the hips. It was an awful sound, like bedsheets shredding. After a while, the air grew rank, the innards of the creatures creating a noxious fume. After an intricate, lengthy slicing, the skinners separated the beasts from their armored shells. Seeing the two parts on their own robbed the experience of its magic. The dragon itself was just a mangled lump of bloodied meat. It was smooth and featureless with a bulging midsection. The armored plates were something new altogether. They were hardened as a juvenile and could be shaped as armor for men. It was tough and as durable as steel, but was flexible and could conform and move on a soldier's body. In addition, the scales could be sharpened to points so fine it could cut flesh without pain. Those were both great things, but the black dragon's most notable use was what happened when their scales were burned. A thick, oily smoke arose in the air. It was suffocating on its own, but mixed with a few other medicinal herbs and plants, it became a healing vapor unlike any other. Breathing the fumes of this wondrous smoke could make physical wounds shrink and disappear. It had the power to mend bones, unclog veins and arteries. Bad eyesight and arthritic joints were made well. My father tried to explain this to me, a 6-year-old who was completely awestruck by the flayed dragons. Smart men burn their scales and the smoke makes you better, he said in his calm, sweet voice. Better? I asked. Remember not long ago when you had that terrible sore throat and cough? Well, this would have taken care of it. But Mommy's honey and tea took care of it, I said, remembering the gooey concoction that eased the burning in my throat. Yes, sweetheart, it did, but the elixir of the black dragon works instantly. It's magic. That notion intrigued me. I would want to learn all about this magic. It was something my father was astonishingly good at, making me interested in the things he talked about. My father was the kindest, most gentle man in the world. He was certainly a one-of-a-kind because the gods surely did not make them like him anymore. He was also humble. Dad never held important jobs. Everything about him was to prove a point, and I loved and hated him for it. It was those lessons that made me struggle, but in those lessons, I learned to grow. It's hard to see the bigger picture while you are living it. You must stop counting trees, step back, and observe the forest. His name was Connor. Just like the rest of my family tree, he lived his entire life in Keswing. In all his years in the City of Light, he only moved twice, once due to floodwaters and once after marrying my mother. All 3 addresses were within a mile of one another. He obviously wasn't a traveler. Most of the work he performed was mediocre: deliveries, temporary guard duty, and the occasional tavern server. After Liam and I were born, he realized he needed a steady job, something to provide a more stable income. 2 weeks before my birth, he started as a quarryman's assistant, a rock hauler for the new cathedral. He was too old even then for that kind of work, but he didn't care. It was for his babies. He came home every evening with sweat-stained shirts covered in rock dust. We could see the wear and tear on his face, the way he hunched over at night and the way he had trouble rising from bed the next morning. His wheezy cough scared Mom. By the time I was 8, Dad was 54 and struggling to make it to work each day. Luckily, the quarry shut down, out of stone, and the building manager for the chapel started importing it from Skyhaven. All the quarry miners took jobs as masons or woodcutters. They were literally trained in days to take over a whole new trade. That was fine with us and with Dad. From then on, he could sit in a workshop out of the harsh weather and sand boards to be affixed to the buttresses. The job was less demanding, better pay, and surprisingly more enjoyable. Everyone was happy.